Today we're going to cover Chapter 2, Culture. Culture is an extremely important variable in the communication process. It can impact the way that we perceive other people, the way that we talk, the things we talk about, which can in turn impact our interpersonal relationships. So today we're going to look at some of the principles that can impact our communication. We're going to look at some of the differences, different ways that communication can vary based on cultures. And then we're going to briefly cover some of the 8 principles of the intercultural communication and apply these to intercultural interactions. So what we need to understand is sort of the idea of what culture might be. Communication scholars, particularly those who study culture, often refer to culture as an iceberg, and this is called the iceberg model. And this was in your PowerPoint slide. This was the triangle that you saw. And notice I'm using an interpersonal message or code right now to enhance my verbal message by using my hand gestures. Just a little way of showing how what we've already talked about applies. So what the iceberg model is it demonstrates that there are different parts of culture that are more readily visible than others. So on the top, if you imagine the iceberg, there's the tip, what's above the water. So those are things we can easily observe. So those would be things like food, tradition, ritual, language. So those would be indicators of culture. Then below the surface of the water, we have other markers of culture that are not so easily seen. So these are things like attitudes, values, beliefs, ways that we perceive the world. And so if we get to know someone better, obviously the things will become more clear, but initially in a relationship, they're not so readily known, and if you don't consider these in an interaction, it can lead to miscommunication. So culture is this idea of a specialized lifestyle of a group of people that is passed on from one generation to the next through communication and not genes. So bound within this is the assumption that culture is learned. So culture impacts pretty much everything that we do. And within that group, people learn different values, beliefs, attitudes, social norms, artifacts, languages, ways of behaving, ways of thinking, ways of talking. So again, who we are, identity, is impacted by what we learn within our culture. Culture also impacts expectations of gender or sex. So thinking about gender roles, and this varies dramatically across cultures. So here in the US, think about what's appropriate, what's expected of a male versus a female. What does it mean to be masculine versus feminine versus Japan versus Australia? Again, these expectations differ based on the culture you are in and their values and their beliefs. There are different things you learn when you're learning culture and different ways of doing that. So you were exposed to the terms enculturation, acculturation, and thinking about those different ways and what you learn in those different processes and how culture is transmitted. But why do we talk about culture, and what is the cultural perspective? Well, we know it's important because it impacts what you say to yourself and how you talk to others. It also is a way to increase our competence because we can be more effective, appropriate, and effective in the way that we communicate if we try to understand where other people are coming from and why they're coming from that particular perspective. So your book talked about some of the principles of culture, and this has to do with efficiency. So fostering efficiency in your relationship versus the idea of maintaining relationships. So when we talk about efficiency, what we're thinking about is when we communicate with people, we want to make sure that in terms of the quantity, that what we're telling people is just enough. You're not giving too little information or too much information. Also quality, so giving people only facts. So people trust typically that what you tell them is true. So being ethical and moral in how you communicate is important. Relation, meaning giving information that is relevant. Again, this would feed into keeping the conversation on track and organized, which would fit then into manner. So I challenge you in this course with some of your speeches to think about ways that you can organize your thoughts and your messages in a meaningful way that's going to help you communicate with your audience about a particular idea. So those have to do with efficiency. And then, as you read, there are 3 principles for maintaining relationships. So the peaceful relations, self-denigration, and politeness. So don't point out errors in others. And again, this is going to vary from culture to culture in terms of what's acceptable. In the US, we typically are a little more lax about that, for better or worse. We are okay with saying, well, you didn't do that quite right. Can I do that? Can I help you? Or in other cultures, that would be extremely disrespectful, and it could potentially ruin a relationship. Also, self-denigration, not taking credit. In the US, again, we're not too good about that. That is kind of one of our cultural practices. And you'll see why if you make the connection when you're thinking about some of the cultural differences. Because we're individualistic in the US, we tend to rely more on individual merit and success, and so therefore we want to take credit. Because we need to show that we have done things to advance. Where in other cultures, it would be seen as hurting the group. Some of cultures that are collectivistic, you would never take credit for something. Even if you did do it, you would say that it was someone else or it was because of the group that you all succeeded. And then politeness, so norms about when to say I'm sorry, when to say thank you. Again, those all vary, and knowing when and how to use those different types of communication would be extremely important in maintaining a healthy relationship. So if I went into all of the cultural differences, this video would probably be about an hour and 15 minutes, because that's usually what it takes when I talk about this in my face-to-face class. So in lieu of discussing all of the different cultural differences, I want to tell you a little bit about the history, sort of how these different categories came to be. And then in your discussion threads, you're going to explore a little bit further this idea by looking at a particular website from the author of these ideas and getting a sense of where we fall in the US versus other countries. So a little bit of a comparison. So these different cultural distinctions, or differences that your books calls them, were actually created by a man named Geert Hofstede back in the 1950s. And he was a researcher for IBM. And IBM at that time was an international company. And they were interested in improving the productivity and efficiencies of the company across the globe. So, for example, they wanted to learn how they could be more productive if they had a team from the US working with a team from Japan. So what he did is he studied over the course of many, many years, I believe it was over a decade, the different cultures and the different ways that people were working and interacting. And after that time, he came up with what were called cultural dimensions. So think of these dimensions as different ways of behaving based on values. So what a culture values is going to influence the way that they then behave. So he was able to come up with the categories of an individualistic versus collectivistic culture or orientation, high versus low context, power structure. So how power is organized within a particular culture. And think about why that might be important in the business sense, in interpersonal communication. That would impact the way that you would talk to a superior versus a subordinate. And if it's okay to, jump right up the chain and in one culture and it's not in the other, think about how that might be perceived, and that might impact the business transaction, probably in a negative way. And then there were the orientations of tolerance for ambiguity, long versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Again, make sure that you reread that section in your text so you understand it, and also look at the website. I think it'll be helpful in explaining these orientations and values a little bit further. All right, so ways that you can improve your communication culturally, so we call this intercultural communication, is you want to be aware, again, of the different values, attitudes, and beliefs, and the way they might shape a message you're sending, or the way the message is received or perceived. And so just know that there are cultural filters that you are using and other people are using to decode the message you're sending. So to be more culturally sensitive, You can prepare yourself, so know that you're dealing with someone who's potentially different from you, and don't perceive difference as a negative thing. Reduce your ethnocentrism. Confront your stereotypes. Unfortunately, these are often learned and not mindful ways of thinking and acting. And so being more mindful of the ways that we group ideas together in our mind and then behave based on these ideas will change the way that you deal with other people and make you more sensitive, because you'll realize that not everyone, because remember we're grouping things together in stereotypes, is like the other. Be mindful. Try to reduce uncertainty. Recognize differences, adjust your communication, and recognize culture shock.